To wound a king was to wound God himself. In 18th century France, the monarch wasn't just a ruler. He was divine flesh, the living vessel of heaven's will. His touch could heal, his word could damn. To strike him wasn't merely treason. It was blasphemy against the natural order. And in a world where kings ruled by sacred right, such a sin could only be answered with something beyond death: erasure. When Robert-François Damiens raised his hand against King Louis XV, he didn't just commit a crime, he unleashed a nightmare. His name would be carved into history's darkest corner, remembered not only for the blade he dared to draw, but for the punishment that followed, a spectacle so obscene, so methodical in its cruelty, it was meant to erase not just a man, but a memory. Yet the true horror began after the execution. For the king's vengeance did not end with Damiens' final scream. It reached further, into his bloodline, into his child, into the fragile innocence of a life that would be hunted, silenced, and forgotten. History remembers the man who tried to kill a king, but it forgets the child who paid the price. The execution of Robert-François Damiens was meant to terrify a nation, but the real punishment was far crueler. His daughter, barely 17, became the living ghost of her father's sin. Cast out, nameless, condemned to wander in exile, she was the final act of the king's revenge, a punishment not of the body, but of the soul. This is her story. How a child became collateral in a monarch's fury, how one act of defiance led to an attempt to erase an entire family from existence. Before he became the monster in every whisper, the name mothers used to frighten their children, Robert-François Damiens was no one. A forgotten servant, a man of odd jobs and failed fortunes. Born on January 9, 1715, in the small village of La Tuilerie near Arras, his life was marked by poverty and restlessness. He drifted from the army to the kitchens of nobles, dismissed again and again for misconduct. His temper earned him the nickname Robert le Diable, Robert the Devil. But no one could have guessed that this petty, volatile man would soon commit the act that would shake the very foundations of France. The France of the 1750s was a powder keg. King Louis XV, once adored as the well-beloved, was now despised. Wars bled the treasury dry. Famine stalked the countryside, and faith itself was divided between the Jansenists and the King's Church. The nation was cracking, and Damiens, drifting among the servants of court officials, heard the rumblings every day. He soaked in their anger, their blasphemy, their whispers that Louis had betrayed his people. Something in him twisted. He began to see himself not as an assassin, but as a divine messenger, a man chosen to punish a corrupt king. On the cold night of January 5, 1757, the royal court glittered inside the palace of Versailles. Torches flickered as King Louis XV stepped toward his waiting carriage. Out of the crowd, a figure lunged, a flash of steel, a gasp, and the faint sound of tearing cloth. The blade struck the king's side. For a moment, silence, then chaos. Guards wrestled Damiens to the ground. The king, pale and stunned, touched his side and saw blood. "Let him be held," Louis gasped, "but let no harm come to him." The wound was shallow, but the sin was infinite. A common man had dared to pierce the sacred flesh of the king, and now all of France would bear witness to what happened to those who touched the divine. The wheels of royal vengeance began to turn, and Damiens was about to learn that there are fates far worse than death. The trial was a formality. The crime was attempted regicide, which the law treated as parricide, the murder of one's own father. Damiens hadn't just attacked a man, he had attacked the symbolic father of the nation. For 2.5 months, he was relentlessly interrogated and tortured. His legs were crushed in a device known as the boot. Yet through it all, Damiens insisted he had acted alone. No grand conspiracy was ever found. He was, as far as anyone could tell, just a disgruntled servant who decided to chastise a king. But having no accomplices wouldn't save him. The sentence was handed down on March 26, 1757, and it was a meticulous script for agony meant to be performed in public as a terrifying show of royal power. On the morning of March 28th, Damiens was taken from his cell. He was forced to make the amende honorable before the great door of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Stripped down to his shirt and holding a heavy torch of burning wax, he had to kneel and confess his crime, begging forgiveness from God, the King, and justice. From there, a cart rumbled towards the Place de Grève, Paris's public execution square, where a massive crowd was buzzing with morbid excitement. This wasn't just an execution, it was theater. What followed is one of the most well-documented and horrific executions in European history. First, the hand that held the knife was burned with flaming sulfur. Damiens screamed but didn't curse. Then, using red-hot pincers, the executioners tore flesh from his chest, arms, and legs. Into these gaping wounds, they poured a boiling mixture of molten lead, oil, and resin. The square filled with the stench of burning flesh and the sounds of a man being systematically unmade. This went on for hours. Yet the final, most dreadful part of the sentence was still to come: dismemberment by horses. 4 strong horses were harnessed to his limbs. They pulled, but Damiens' body, incredibly, refused to break. The crowd grew restless. The executioners, inexperienced with this ancient punishment, were failing. Finally, under orders, the executioner Charles-Henri Sanson had to take a knife and sever the man's tendons and joints. With the next pull, his limbs began to tear away. Eyewitness accounts, chilling in their detail, report that Damiens was still alive, his head turning to watch his own body being ripped apart. Some say he finally died when his last arm was severed. His torso, reportedly still moving, was thrown onto a bonfire. His body and severed limbs were burned until only ashes remained. As the last of the smoke cleared, the court's final order was carried out. The ashes of Robert-François Damiens were gathered and thrown to the wind, a symbolic act to ensure that not one physical trace of him remained on the earth. The man was gone. But the king's revenge was just getting started. The annihilation of Damiens' body was only step 1. Step 2 was aimed not at flesh and bone, but at memory and legacy. The court decreed that his very existence and that of his family be scrubbed from France. First, his home was to be razed to the ground, with a specific order that nothing ever be built on that spot again. It was to become a cursed, empty piece of land. Next came the name. The court ordered Damiens' father, brothers, and sisters to change their surname. The name Damiens was now outlawed, a forbidden word. To carry it was to be stained with the most heinous crime imaginable. His siblings were forced to adopt new identities, to sever the link to their brother, and vanish. Imagine being told your name, your heritage, is now illegal. You're forced to lie about who you are for the rest of your life, always terrified that someone might uncover your connection to the infamous Regicide. But the cruelest part of the king's revenge was reserved for Damiens' wife and daughter. They were to be banished from the kingdom of France forever. While Damiens' wife and elderly father were adults, his daughter was a child, a teenager around 17 years old. History has so thoroughly followed the court's decree of erasure that we don't even know her first name for certain. She is a ghost, a footnote in her father's horrific story. A girl who had committed no crime, yet was about to pay a terrible price. During the investigation, Damiens' wife and daughter were held in the Bastille and questioned, though it was clear they knew nothing of his plan. But their innocence didn't matter. They were extensions of him, and they had to be purged. Banishment was a sentence of social death. For Damiens' daughter, it meant being torn from everything she had ever known. Her home, her friends, her country, her future, all gone. She was declared an outcast. She, her mother, and her grandfather were escorted to the border and cast out, left to fend for themselves in a world where they had no connections and a name they could no longer speak. In a strange and merciful twist, it seems King Louis XV himself may have shown a sliver of pity. Some accounts suggest he secretly granted the exiled family a pension to ensure they didn't starve. It's a bizarre contradiction. A king who sanctioned a monstrous public execution yet quietly offered a lifeline to the family he had just condemned. Perhaps it was a pang of conscience, or maybe it was a calculated act to ensure they disappeared quietly. Regardless, a pension couldn't buy back a life. Think of this young woman. She had just seen her father become the most hated man in France. She heard the graphic details of his execution, a horror that would haunt her forever. And now she was being sent into exile, branded by a crime she didn't commit. Where did she go? History doesn't say. The erasure was successful. We can only imagine her and her mother crossing the border, trying to build a new life under a false name. Every introduction, a lie. Every new friendship built on a secret. She could never speak of her father. She could never properly mourn him. To the world, she had to pretend he never existed. This was the true nature of the king's revenge. It wasn't just about making an example of Damiens. It was about Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. While her father's punishment was a storm of fire and agony that lasted hours, hers was a quiet, cold, lifelong sentence. The execution of Robert-François Damiens was a powerful statement about the nature of power in the Ancien Regime. It was based on the old concept of the king's two bodies. The king had a physical body that was mortal and could be wounded, as Louis XV's was. But he also had a body politic, a sacred, immortal body that represented the kingdom itself. An attack on the king's physical body was seen as an attack on the mystical body of France, treason against both the state and God. The horrific spectacle in the Place de Grève was a ritual. By destroying Damiens' body with such overwhelming force, the monarchy was demonstrating its absolute power and restoring the sanctity of the king. It was a message written in blood and fire that the king was untouchable. But this event, meant to solidify royal authority, would be remembered as one of the last gasps of such medieval brutality. It happened during the Age of Enlightenment, when thinkers like Voltaire and Cesare Beccaria were arguing for reason, human rights, and an end to cruel punishments. The almost theatrical cruelty of the execution felt like a relic from a darker time. The philosopher Michel Foucault would later use the detailed account of this very execution to open his landmark book, Discipline and Punish, contrasting this raw, public display of power with the more subtle forms of control that would define the modern world. The execution was meant as a deterrent, but its sheer barbarity may have had the opposite effect. It exposed the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the absolute power of the monarch and the lives of ordinary people. The irony is profound. Just 36 years later, in that same square, renamed the Place de la Révolution, another French king would meet his end. Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis XV, was executed not by the arcane rituals of regicide, but by the swift, mechanical blade of the guillotine. His death wasn't a spectacle to sanctify the monarchy, but a political act meant to destroy it. The world where a king could order a man torn apart and his family erased from history was coming to a violent end. The story of Robert-François Damiens and his forgotten daughter is a stark reminder of how power, punishment, and memory are intertwined. History is filled with these erased narratives and brutal truths that are often left out of textbooks. If you found this journey through the dark heart of the past compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Ancient Vault. We uncover the forgotten figures, brutal acts, and haunting stories that shaped our world because history's darkest corners deserve to be remembered. In the end, King Louis XV's revenge was both a total success and a colossal failure. He succeeded in his immediate goal. Robert-François Damiens was obliterated in a display of ultimate dominance. His family name was abolished, his house was destroyed, and his daughter was banished, her identity so thoroughly scrubbed that she remains a ghost to this day. But in the long view of history, the act backfired. The savagery of the punishment wasn't seen as a mark of divine right, but as a symptom of a decaying tyrannical system. It became a symbol of the very injustice the French Revolution would rise up against. In its effort to prove its absolute power, the monarchy had only revealed the terrifying depths of its own brutality. The story leaves us with a haunting question. The physical torture of Damiens lasted for hours, but it had an end. The punishment inflicted upon his daughter, a life of forced obscurity, stolen identity, and perpetual exile, was a silent, unending sentence. What is a worse fate? To be brutally unmade in a public square, or to be forced to live as a ghost, forbidden from ever being who you are? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.